It was a quiet night in the small town of Willow Creek, where the streets are usually calm, and the loudest sound is the occasional bark of a restless dog. Officer James Carter was nearing the end of his shift, looking forward to heading home to his wife and their newborn daughter. It had been an uneventful night, just a few routine patrols, a minor traffic stop, and a couple of neighborhood complaints. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. Only 45 minutes to go. He adjusted the radio and took another sip of his now lukewarm coffee, thinking he might actually make it through the night without anything noteworthy happening. But then the call came in. "Dispatch to Unit 12, crackled the voice over the radio. James reached for the receiver, a slight frown forming as he recognized the dispatcher's tone. It was tense, uncertain. "We've got a report of strange noises coming from the old Miller property on Hawthorne Lane. Caller says it's been going on for the past hour. Sounds like crying, maybe yelling. No one's lived there in years. Can you check it out?" James hesitated for a moment. The Miller house was infamous in Willow Creek. It had stood abandoned for over a decade, its once pristine white paint now chipped and grey, the windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. Local kids whispered stories about it being haunted, and even the bravest among them rarely dared to venture onto the property after dark. He shook off the unease creeping up his spine and keyed the mic. "Copy that, dispatch. I'm en route," he said, his voice steady. As he drove toward Hawthorne Lane, the streets grew darker, the street lights sparse in this part of town. The Miller house loomed in the distance, its silhouette airy against the faint glow of the moon. James parked his cruiser at the curb, the headlights illuminating the tangled bushes that had long overtaken the front yard. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel, and instinctively rested his hand on the grip of his flashlight. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as he approached the front gate. It creaked loudly when he pushed it open, the sound echoing into the night. He paused, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like crying, soft and broken, coming from somewhere inside the house. James's pulse quickened as he approached the front door. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently with each gust of wind. He nudged it open with the toe of his boot, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air inside was stale, the smell of mildew and decay thick in the cramped space. "Police," he called out, his voice firm but calm. "Is anyone here?" No answer. The crying grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wail of someone in pain, but rather the kind of sob that comes from deep, unrelenting sorrow. James followed the sound, his flashlight sweeping over the dust-covered furniture and peeling wallpaper. The house felt frozen in time, as if the Millers had left in a hurry and never returned. The noise seemed to be coming from the basement. James hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining his flashlight down into the darkness. "Hello, I'm with the police. If someone's down there, say something." Still no response, just the soft, gut-wrenching sobs. He descended the stairs slowly, each step groaning under his weight. When he reached the bottom, the smell hit him first. A damp, earthy scent mixed with something else, something faintly metallic. His flashlight illuminated the small, cluttered space. Boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs filled every corner. But in the center of the room, there was something James didn't expect. A small blanket, bunched up on the floor, moving ever so slightly. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, heart pounding in his chest. As he reached down to pull back the blanket, the crying suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, James felt a chill run down his spine. He peeled back the blanket slowly, bracing himself for what he might find. What he saw next would stay with him forever, a sight so unexpected and heart-wrenching that it brought tears to his eyes. But what James found that night wasn't just the start of a shocking discovery. It was the beginning of a story that would shake the entire town to its core. And nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. James crouched low, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip as he stared at the small figure curled up beneath the blanket. At first, he couldn't comprehend what he was looking at. It was a child, no older than 3 or 4 years old, huddled in on themselves, their tiny frames shaking as though the world had pressed all its weight onto their fragile shoulders. Their hair was messy and matted, their clothes torn and dirty. The child's wide eyes, gleaming in the beam of his flashlight, blinked up at him in confusion and fear. They didn't cry anymore, but their lips quivered, and their chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. For a moment, James was frozen, overwhelmed by 1,000 unanswered questions. What was a child doing here, alone, in an abandoned house? How had they survived? And why hadn't anyone noticed something so strange before? "Hey there," James said softly, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. He forced calm into his voice, though his heart was racing. "It's okay. You're safe now. I'm Officer Carter. Can you tell me your name?" The child didn't answer. Instead, they clutched the edge of the blanket tighter, as if it was their only protection from the outside world. James glanced around the basement, his senses now fully on high alert. There was no sign of anyone else, but something about the space felt wrong. The air was too heavy, the silence too absolute, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind through cracks in the house. "It's okay," he tried again, crouching a little lower to make himself seem less intimidating. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." The child's gaze flickered toward the stairs, and James followed their line of sight instinctively. His stomach dropped. He hadn't noticed it before, but in the far corner of the basement, there was a door, barely visible in the shadows. It was heavy and rusted, with a padlock hanging loosely from the latch, as if it had been pried open recently. "Is someone else here?" James asked, keeping his voice steady, though every nerve in his body was screaming at him to prepare for the worst. He reached for his radio, only to realize it wasn't clipped to his belt. He must have left it in the car in his rush to check out the scene. The child shook their head, the movement so small and hesitant it was almost imperceptible. But their eyes stayed fixed on the door, wide and unblinking. James took a deep breath, torn between staying with the child and investigating the mysterious room. "All right," he said softly, his eyes flicking back to the child. "You're going to be okay. Just stay right here, all right? I'll be back in a second." The child didn't respond, but they didn't move either, their tiny fingers clutching the blanket like a lifeline. James rose slowly, his flashlight aimed at the rusted door. Each step he took toward it felt heavier, like the air itself was trying to push him back. When he reached the door, he noticed scratches along the frame, deep, jagged marks that looked as though they'd been made by someone desperate to get out or in. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning loudly. Beyond it was a smaller room, barely large enough to move around in. The walls were bare concrete, stained with something James didn't want to identify. In the center of the room, there was a single chair, bolted to the floor. James's flashlight hovered over the chair, and his throat tightened. There were restraints on the armrests, frayed and worn, as if they'd been used too many times. On the floor beneath it, scattered among the dust and debris, were scraps of paper, their edges curled and yellowed. He crouched down and picked up one of the pieces, his gloved fingers trembling. It was a drawing, a crude sketch in crayon, the kind you'd expect from a young child. But the image was far from innocent. It showed a figure, a tall, shadowy form, with exaggerated limbs and hollow eyes. Surrounding the figure were smaller, stick-like people, their arms reaching out as if in pain or fear. James felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He shuffled through the other scraps of paper, each one more unsettling than the last. Images of the same shadowy figure appeared again and again, looming over what seemed to be a child, sometimes with jagged, scribbled lines that resembled screams or cries for help. His gut churned, a mix of dread and confusion swirling within him. He shoved the drawings into his pocket and backed out of the room, the weight of the air pressing down on him harder now. Something was deeply wrong here. When he returned to the main basement, the child was still sitting in the same spot, their eyes locked on him with an expression that was almost unreadable. Not quite fear, not quite relief, something in between, as though they were trying to decide if he was someone they could trust. "Let's get you out of here," James said, keeping his voice gentle. He extended a hand, but the child hesitated. "It's all right, I'll take you somewhere safe." After a long moment, the child finally reached out, their small hand slipping into his. It was cold, ice cold, and James felt a pang of anger. Who could leave a child in this condition, alone and terrified? He carried the child up the stairs, their slight weight barely registering. When they reached the first floor, James glanced around once more, uneasy about leaving without investigating further. But the child's safety came first. He pushed the front door open and stepped out into the night, breathing deeply of the crisp, fresh air. As he placed the child gently into the back seat of his patrol car, they began to speak, softly, barely audible over the sound of the wind. They said they would come back, the child murmured, their voice hoarse and trembling. James froze, leaning closer to hear them. "Who said that? Who's they?" The child's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't answer. Instead, they turned their gaze toward the darkened house, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the shadows. James felt a chill creep down his spine. He didn't know what he'd stumbled into tonight, but it was far from over. Whatever had happened in that house wasn't just the past, it was still lingering, still waiting. And for the first time in years, James felt the sharp edge of fear pierce through his sense of duty. James sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine doing little to drown out the questions swirling in his mind. The child sat in the back seat, silent and staring out the window, their tiny frame wrapped in the scratchy blanket he found in the basement. Every few minutes, James glanced at the rearview mirror, hoping they might say something more, offer some clue to unravel the unsettling events of the night. But they stayed quiet, their face a mask of exhaustion and something deeper, something James could only describe as haunted. He picked up his radio, now securely clipped to his vest, and called it in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got a child, approximately 4 years old, found at the Miller property. They're unharmed but appear malnourished and frightened. I'm bringing them to the station for further assistance, requesting immediate contact with Child Protective Services." The dispatcher's response was quick, professional, but James could hear the undercurrent of unease in her voice. The Miller property wasn't the kind of place that came up often in their reports, and when it did, the stories were never straightforward. As he drove, James couldn't shake the images he'd seen in the basement. The drawings in his pocket felt heavier than they should, as if carrying the weight of some unspeakable truth. He glanced in the mirror again, watching the child. Their eyes remained fixed on the road behind them, scanning the darkness as though expecting something to emerge. "Hey," James said gently, keeping his tone casual. "Do you have any family? Someone I can call to come pick you up?" The child didn't answer. They just kept staring, their small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "Okay," James continued, trying a different approach. "Do you know how you got to that house? Were you with someone before?" This time, the child turned their head slightly, but their gaze didn't meet his. Instead, they whispered something so softly he almost didn't hear it. "They said it was safe there," the child murmured. James felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Who said that? Can you tell me who they are?" The child's lips pressed together, their eyes dropping to their lap. James didn't push further, sensing that any more questions might only make them retreat further into themselves. When they arrived at the station, James carried the child inside, their small head resting against his shoulder. "Found them at the old Miller place," James explained briefly, setting the child down on a chair in the corner of the room. "I'll handle the paperwork. Can someone grab them some water and maybe a snack?" One of the officers nodded, disappearing into the break room. James knelt in front of the child, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. We'll figure this out, okay?" The child didn't respond, but they didn't seem as tense as before. James stood and walked to his desk, pulling out the crumpled drawings from his pocket. He spread them out in front of him, studying each one carefully. The shadowy figure appeared in every sketch, its presence looming and malevolent. James couldn't help but feel that it wasn't just a product of the child's imagination. "Carter," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Officer Daniels, a veteran of the force and someone who'd been around long enough to know all the stories about Willow Creek. "You said you found the kid at the Miller house." "Yeah," James replied, leaning back in his chair. "Why?" Daniels rubbed the back of his neck, his expression uneasy. "That place, it's got a history. You know that, right?" "I've heard the rumors," James said, his tone skeptical. "Ghost stories mostly. Kids trying to scare each other. What are you getting at?" Daniels pulled up a chair, lowering his voice. "It's not just stories. Back in the late 80s, there was a family living there. The Millers. Nice people by all accounts, but then one day, they just disappeared. Left everything behind. No note, no explanation. It was like they'd been plucked out of existence. Over the years, a few people bought the property, tried to fix it up, but none of them stayed long. Strange noises, lights flickering, stuff going missing. Everyone who lived there said the same thing. They felt like they were being watched." James frowned, the weight of Daniel's words settling uneasily in his mind. "You think what happened tonight is connected to that?" Daniels shrugged. "I don't know. But if there's one thing I've learned in this job, it's that every story has a kernel of truth. You might want to dig into the house's history, see if anything jumps out." James nodded, his thoughts already racing. He thanked Daniels and returned to his desk, opening his laptop to pull up property records and old police reports. The Miller house had a long paper trail, most of it mundane: real estate transactions, zoning violations, utility bills. But one file caught his attention, an incident report from 1991. The report detailed a call from a neighbor who claimed to have seen lights on in the house despite it being abandoned. Officers responded, but found nothing unusual, though one of them noted in his statement that the house felt wrong, like the walls were listening. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The more he learned, the less sense any of it made. He glanced over at the child, who was now nibbling on a granola bar one of the officers had given them. Their small shoulders were hunched, their eyes darting around the room as if they still couldn't believe they were safe. Before he could dive back into his research, his phone buzzed. It was dispatch, letting him know that Child Protective Services would be arriving shortly to take the child into their care. James felt a pang of reluctance at the thought of handing them over, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Still, something about the whole situation gnawed at him. The child's words, the drawings, the strange room in the basement, it all pointed to something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. He decided then and there that he wasn't done with this case. As the CPS worker arrived and began speaking softly to the child, James felt a chill run down his spine. He turned toward the door, where a gust of cold air seemed to seep in from nowhere. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move just beyond the glass, lingering at the edge of the station's parking lot. When he stepped outside to investigate, there was nothing there, just the wind, rustling through the trees. But James couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he'd uncovered at the Miller house wasn't finished with him yet. James sat in his cruiser in the dim light of the parking lot, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space as his thoughts raced. The child was safe now, under the watchful eye of CPS, but James couldn't shake the feeling that their safety was temporary. Something was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of what he could see or understand. The shadow he thought he'd seen earlier lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight, and the station was winding down. Most of his colleagues had gone home, leaving the precinct eerily quiet. James took a deep breath, his hand resting on the crumpled drawings in his pocket. He knew there was only one place he could go to find answers. The Miller house loomed in his thoughts like a storm cloud. He didn't want to go back there alone, but something told him time was of the essence. Whatever had happened to that child, whatever had been haunting that place for decades, wasn't going to wait for daylight. James drove through the empty streets of Willow Creek, the beam of his headlights cutting through the dark. The houses thinned out the closer he got to Hawthorne Lane, and by the time he pulled up to the Miller property, the road was flanked only by trees. The house stood there, still and silent, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. He stepped out of the car, his flashlight in one hand and his other hovering near his holster. The air was colder than it had been earlier, and the wind carried a faint whisper, as if the house itself was breathing. James steeled himself and pushed open the creaking gate, the sound cutting through the stillness. The front door was as he'd left it, slightly ajar. He nudged it open with his shoulder, his flashlight sweeping over the familiar sight of dust-covered furniture and peeling wallpaper. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. There was a weight to the air, a presence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. James moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He headed straight for the basement, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows as he descended the stairs. The blanket was still there, crumpled on the floor where the child had been sitting, but the door to the smaller room was now closed. His breath caught. He was sure he'd left it open. Slowly, he approached the door, his hand resting on his holster. He nudged it open with the tip of his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The chair was still there, bolted to the floor, but something was different. The air was colder, almost freezing, and there was a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. James scanned the room, his flashlight revealing nothing out of place. But the tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. It was coming from above him. His heart pounded as he turned and climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty house. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone knocking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. When he reached the main floor, the tapping stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt oppressive, pressing down on him like a physical weight. James swept his flashlight across the room, every shadow seeming to shift and move at the edges of his vision. "Is someone here?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. No response. He moved cautiously through the house, checking each room. They were all empty, just as they had been earlier. But as he returned to the living room, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a picture frame lying face down on the mantel. James picked it up, the cracked glass crunching under his gloves. The photo inside was faded, but the faces were still visible, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling in front of the house. The Millers. As he studied the picture, the tapping started again, louder this time. It was coming from the walls. James froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the house. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence was broken by a new sound, a faint, high-pitched whisper that sent chills down James's spine. It was coming from the basement. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to move, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He descended the stairs once more, the flashlight beam shaking as it swept over the space. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but he couldn't make out the words. It was like a dozen voices speaking at once, layered and chaotic. The door to the small room was wide open now, though James hadn't touched it. He stepped inside, the cold air biting at his skin. The voices seemed to converge here, their whispers turning into an almost audible hum. On the floor, in the center of the room, was something new, a small, dirt-covered box. It looked ancient, the wood warped and cracked. James knelt cautiously, his hand hovering over the lid. The voices seemed to intensify, that urgency growing. As he opened the box, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into darkness. The voices crescendoed into a deafening roar, and James stumbled back, his heart racing. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room was silent, the air still. James fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking as he switched it back on. The beam illuminated the empty room. The box was gone. James stood there, his breath ragged, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Whatever force had been unleashed wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. James stood frozen in the middle of the room, his breathing ragged, the flashlight trembling in his grip. He scanned the space again, desperate to understand what had just happened. The box was gone, and so were the whispers, but the oppressive atmosphere in the room remained. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, lingering just out of sight. As he turned to leave the room, his flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the walls. James felt his chest tighten as one shadow didn't move with the others. It stood still, elongated and distorted, like it didn't belong to anything in the room. He aimed the beam directly at it, but the light passed through as if it wasn't there. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, childlike giggle. It echoed faintly, coming from somewhere above him. James clenched his jaw, his heart racing. It wasn't the same as the whispers he'd heard earlier. This laugh was high-pitched and playful, yet it carried an undertone that set his nerves on edge. He bolted up the stairs, his boots pounding against the wooden steps, determined to find the source. The sound grew louder as he reached the main floor, reverberating through the empty house. James's pulse pounded in his ears as he followed the noise, which seemed to drift toward the front door. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the windowpane next to the door. James whipped around, his flashlight illuminating the glass. For a split second, he thought he saw a face, small, pale, and childlike, staring back at him before it disappeared into the darkness. He yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the freezing night air. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing into the emptiness. "Who's there?" There was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But as he scanned the yard, his flashlight caught something unusual, a trail of small footprints leading away from the house. They were too small to be an adult's, and the pattern suggested they were bare, despite the cold. James followed the trail cautiously, his boots crunching against the frosted ground. The footprints led toward the tree line at the edge of the property, disappearing into the dense woods. He hesitated, the darkness ahead feeling impenetrable, but he couldn't ignore the pull of whatever was drawing him in. As he entered the woods, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around him. His flashlight beam flickered again, but he pressed on, following the faint trail of footprints. Every so often, he thought he heard movement, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But whenever he turned, there was nothing there. The trail finally led him to a small clearing, where he froze in disbelief. In the center of the clearing was the box, the same one he'd seen in the basement, now sitting pristine on the ground, as if it had been waiting for him. James approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to leave it alone. But he couldn't walk away, not now. He knelt beside the box, his flashlight illuminating its surface. The wood, once warped and aged, now looked smooth and polished, the carvings on it intricate and unfamiliar. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the lid, and a sudden rush of cold shot through his hand, up his arm, and into his chest. He gasped, pulling back, but the chill didn't fade. Instead, it spread, an icy grip that seemed to latch onto his very core. Before he could react, a voice echoed through the clearing. It was soft, almost melodic, but unmistakably inhuman. "You shouldn't have come back." James spun around, his flashlight darting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice breaking slightly. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted, coalescing into a shape. It wasn't human, not entirely. The figure was tall and thin, its form obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the night. James stumbled back, his heart hammering. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move, but the voice came again, softer this time. "You opened the door. Now it cannot be closed." James felt the weight of the words settle over him, heavy and suffocating. He didn't understand what the figure meant, but he knew, deep down, that he'd unleashed something he couldn't control. As the figure dissolved back into the shadows, the box began to hum softly, a low vibration that resonated through the clearing. James turned back to it, his hands trembling. He wanted to leave, to run as far as he could, but his body wouldn't move. The lid of the box began to lift on its own, revealing an empty interior, empty, except for a faint, pulsating light at its center. The light grew brighter, blinding him, and then everything went still. When James blinked, he was no longer in the clearing. He was back in the basement of the Miller house, standing in the center of the room, the box still in his hands. The chair, the walls, everything was as it had been earlier, but now there was a new sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the house, growing louder with each passing second. James realized with a sinking dread that the sound wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from beneath his feet. James froze as the tapping beneath his feet grew louder and more insistent. His breath quickened, his grip on the box tightening. Every instinct told him to run, to get as far away from this house as possible, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone knocking in a steady rhythm, demanding to be let out. The floor beneath him groaned, and for a moment, James thought it might give way. He backed toward the stairs, his flashlight sweeping across the room, desperate for any sign of what might be below. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. And then the voice came again, soft and chilling. "You opened the door. Now you must face what lies beyond." James turned, his flashlight flickering wildly, but there was no one there. The voice echoed around him, impossibly close yet impossible to pinpoint. The box in his hands began to hum again, vibrating with an intensity that made his fingers numb. "Stop it," James shouted, his voice cracking. He dropped the box, but instead of hitting the ground, it hovered mid-air, the light inside it pulsing brighter and brighter. The floor beneath him groaned again, and this time, a crack split the wood. James stumbled back, barely keeping his balance as the crack widened, revealing a dark void below. The hum from the box intensified, resonating through the room and making the walls shudder. From the void, a hand emerged. It was thin and pale, its fingers unnaturally long, the nails blackened and sharp. James stared in horror as another hand followed, then a face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and twisted in a grotesque smile. "Help me," it whispered, though its voice was anything but human. James backed up the stairs, his heart pounding as the figure pulled itself out of the void. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unsteady hand. "Stay back," James yelled, pulling his gun from its holster. His hands shook as he aimed at the figure. The creature tilted its head, its smile widening. "You think that will stop me?" Before James could react, the creature lunged forward, its impossibly long arms reaching for him. He fired, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature, but instead of recoiling, it seemed to absorb the impact, the hole in its chest closing instantly. "You can't fight what you invited," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. James stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall. The creature advanced, its hollow eyes locked on him. Desperation surged through him as he searched for something, anything, that could stop it. His flashlight caught the glint of the box, still hovering in the air. The light inside the box pulsed again, and James felt a strange pull, like it was calling to him. Without thinking, he lunged for it, his fingers brushing against the surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy shot through him, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, air-spitting sound that made James drop to his knees. The light from the box grew brighter and brighter, engulfing everything. James squeezed his eyes shut, his hands pressed to his ears as the sound reached a crescendo. And then silence. When James opened his eyes, he was no longer in the basement. He was standing in the middle of the clearing in the woods, the box lying at his feet. The air was still, the night eerily quiet. The oppressive weight he felt all night was gone, replaced by an unsettling calm. James picked up the box, its surface now cold and inert. The carvings were gone, replaced by smooth, unmarked wood. He turned it over in his hands, but it seemed completely ordinary, as if whatever power it had held was gone. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, a voice broke the silence. "Officer Carter," it said softly. James spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the child he found at the Miller house. They looked different now, calmer, their eyes clearer, but their expression was somber. "You stopped it," the child said, then a voice steady. James took a cautious step forward. What was it? What happened back there? The child tilted their head, their gaze distant. It was waiting for someone to open the door. "You closed it, but the door isn't gone. It never really goes away." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? Is it still here?" The child didn't answer. Instead, they turned and walked into the woods, their small figure disappearing into the shadows. James called out to them, but there was no response. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the box heavy in his hands, before finally making his way back to his cruiser. As he drove back to the station, the events of the night replayed in his mind, each detail more surreal than the last. When he pulled into the parking lot, he glanced at the passenger seat, where he'd placed the box, but it was gone. James sat in silence, staring at the empty seat, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. He didn't know what he'd unleashed, or if it was truly over. All he knew was that the shadow of the Miller house would follow him forever, a reminder that some doors are better left closed. James sat in his cruiser, staring at the empty seat beside him. The eerie silence of the night seemed to press down on him, and despite the weight of exhaustion in his bones, his mind refused to quiet. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he tried to make sense of what had happened. What had really happened? He had closed the door that had been opened so many years ago by someone else. But that voice, the child's voice, still echoed in his mind. The door isn't gone. It never really goes away. He thought of the child, so small, so fragile, and the horrors they had endured. It had been a fight for survival, a fight against something that had been lurking for decades. And yet, here he was, no closer to understanding the full truth of what had happened in that house. James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his mind kept returning to the question that had haunted him since he first set foot in the Miller house. What exactly had he closed? He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever force had been waiting for him, whatever darkness had been clawing at the walls, wasn't truly gone. He knew that the box, the artifact, whatever it was, had been the key. But had he really closed the door? Or had he merely shifted the weight of what had been trapped inside onto someone else who might never escape? He shook his head, willing the thoughts away. There was no use in speculating, not now. The case was closed, at least for the time being. The child was safe, and the house would be sealed off until further investigation. He'd done his duty. But as he looked up at the stars, a chill ran down his spine. What if it wasn't enough? What if that that presence, was still out there, waiting for another opportunity? What if the next person who found the house didn't have the strength to close it again? He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in thought, but when he finally pulled himself together and drove back to the station, he had a decision to make. It was time to let go, or at least try to. The station was quieter than usual when he walked through the door. Only a few officers remained, working late shifts or finishing paperwork. He passed through the bullpen, making his way to the back office where Chief Malone was going over some files. The older man looked up when he entered, his tired eyes narrowing as he saw the exhaustion etched into James' face. "You okay, Carter?" the chief asked, his voice gravelly. James didn't answer right away, his mind still swirling. Instead, he set down a file on the chief's desk. "I need you to take care of this," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Malone glanced at the file, then back at James. He could see something in his officer's eyes, something that made him hesitate before replying. James nodded, though he knew that wasn't going to happen. Rest wasn't something he would find tonight. Instead, he left the station and drove through the empty streets of Willow Creek, the silence almost suffocating. The small town was never really quiet, but tonight it felt like something was holding its breath. By the time James pulled up to his apartment, the weight of the night had begun to settle on him. He walked into the building, barely noticing the few lights still on in the hall. The air felt dense, as if something was pressing against him from all sides. As he reached his door, he paused, sensing something different. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the atmosphere, something barely perceptible. James shook it off as his own mind playing tricks on him. But when he stepped inside, he saw it. The box. It sat on his kitchen counter, the smooth, polished wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. James stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't brought the box back with him. He hadn't seen it since the clearing in the woods. He was sure of that. With a shaking hand, he reached for it, his mind racing. The light inside the box flickered softly, then stabilized, casting a faint glow that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. James's breath caught as the memories flooded back, the voice, the tapping, the figure that had emerged from the shadows. But as his fingers brushed the lid of the box, he felt a coldness creep up his arm, a familiar, terrifying sensation. The presence wasn't gone. It had only been waiting for the right moment to return. James slammed the lid shut, his hands trembling. The box stopped pulsing, the glow fading as if it had never been. But the feeling lingered in the pit of his stomach, in the deep recesses of his mind. He wasn't sure what to do anymore. He couldn't just leave it, could he? No, that would be a mistake. He had to destroy it, to make sure it never found its way back to someone else. He looked around his apartment, trying to focus. His gaze landed on the small fireplace in the corner. It wasn't much, just an old iron grate, but it would have to do. James made up his mind in an instant. He was going to burn it, once and for all. But as he stepped toward the fire, he hesitated. The box didn't glow, didn't hum with energy anymore, but something about it felt, alive. Suddenly, the door to his apartment swung open. James spun around, startled, to see the child, the same child he had saved, the one from the Miller house, standing in the doorway. Their eyes were no longer wide with fear. They were calm, serene even. "You don't have to burn it," the child said softly, their voice no longer childish but mature, knowing. James's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? It's the only way." The child shook their head. "You don't understand. If you burn it, you release it." James's throat went dry. "Release it? I thought I closed it." "You didn't. You can't." The child stepped forward, closer to the box. "You never will. It's part of the house now, part of this place, and it will always find its way back." James felt the weight of the words settle over him. There was no escaping it. There never had been. The child turned and walked out the door, leaving James alone with the box once more. He stared at it, realizing in that moment that the true horror wasn't in what was in the box, but in what had always been waiting for someone to open it. As the child's figure disappeared into the night, James knew that this story wasn't over. It was never going to be. The door wasn't gone. It was simply waiting for the next soul to stumble across it.